going to go over another example today of using jQuery to fetch data from the Star Wars API. So it's actually quite similar to the previous video, but I'm not going to write the code because this is about a different way to organize the code that we've written to do this task. So I have my basic template here for my index.html, and I've actually separated out my code into my JavaScript code into two files because I want to start working towards the idea of a model view controller organization for code in a JavaScript application. So I have an index.js, which is the main sort of document ready handler, and that's going to define the code there to what's actually going to happen. And you can see this code, you can see this part here is the loop which is going to actually do the insertion of the episode information into the page. That's what we had in the previous video. But I'm doing things a little bit differently in that I've got now this code up here which is making a new thing called an SW, Star Wars, and running get data. So I'm actually putting the code that handles getting the data and dealing with the data into another module. So let's have a look at that other module. And you can see that in the index.js I'm loading that model module first and then the index.js module second. So this module here begins with our usual function, anonymous function, which is called immediately at the end. See the brackets there. What I'm doing in here is defining a JavaScript object. And so I have defined an object called SW. Remember, a JavaScript object is essentially a function which we'll use the operator new to work on this. And so this function here just sets up the variables, and I'm setting up a variable called URL, which is the URL endpoint for the films API. And then I'm having a variable films, which is going to be the data that is coming back from this API. I'm going to store it inside this object. Okay, so that's the basic constructor, if you like, for the JavaScript object, the SW object. And now I'm going to define some methods on this object. And the first method is going to be the one that does the fetching of the data. Okay, so the fetching of the data, so the get data method is a function which takes no arguments, and the main thing that it does is this jQuery get request. Okay, and so we get the URL, but this time the success function, instead of the success function actually modifying the page, which I had in the previous example, the success function is setting the object variable films to the data that is returned. And then it's also then dispatching a new event. Let me talk about that in a second. So there are a couple of things going on here. You'll notice that I'm doing this weird thing here saying var self equals this. And this has to do with JavaScript context and JavaScript execution. What I want to happen when the request comes back from the server is that I want the films attribute of the object that made this request to be set to the data. In JavaScript, it's a little bit tricky to actually sometimes work out what the current object is. And so we're using this method here to sort of lock in the object. So this thing get data is a method of the instance of the SW object. Okay, so when we're inside this function, then this variable is set up by JavaScript to reference the particular object that made this call. Unfortunately, when this function runs here, this is the function that is run when the URL retrieval has finished, so when we've got the data back from that URL. When this function runs, the variable this will be set to something else. It might be the window, it might be the AJAX request or something, but it's not going to be the object that we actually want to store the data in. And so in order to give this, to be able to get the right thing, I do this. I use self here as a local variable inside this function. Essentially, it's just a copy of this, and I'm going to refer to self here. Now, JavaScript, so this is this is the thing called a closure in JavaScript. That will essentially remember the value of self at the time we set up this function, so that the thing that actually will get the films is the thing that called this function. Now, that's quite complicated, and if you don't understand that, I don't think it's a personal failing. It is complicated, and so I'm providing this as a sort of template for you in some way to look at, and this is how we'll try and deal with this issue in the code that we write. So there's my explanation, and I'll put some notes up about it as well and reference some things, but this is what we're doing. So we're storing the data in the object that made this call, which is going to be our instance of SW. What we're going to do then is, because what we want to do is when that data comes back, we want the page to be uploaded, to be updated, but we don't want to handle that updating of the page in the model. Remember, model view controller tries to separate out the bits that do the view part, the updating of the page, from the bit that does the handling of the data. So how do we separate those two out? In JavaScript, we do it with an event. So I'm actually going to generate a new event. I've actually invented a new kind of event in JavaScript. Remember, it has all these events like onClick and onMouseOver. Well, I've invented a new event here called DataChanged. And what I'm going to do is when the data is actually being loaded, I'm going to issue this dispatch this event called DataChanged, a DataChanged event, and then somewhere else in my code, I can actually respond to that. And we can see actually in the index.js function, that's exactly what I've got here. I've set up a handler for data changed, and when that event is run, then it's going to run this function. That function will call the getFilms method, and then it will update the page. So that's how we're going to handle separating out these two things as part of this application. Just to finish off this, what I've got in this file, I've defined a method called getFilms, which is going to return the actual films. Remember that the films were actually stored on the results attribute of the object that's returned from the API. So since that's what I'm really interested in just at the moment, I'm going to return that. So this checks to see if the films is empty, and that might be if we've not actually gotten the data yet, then it's just going to return the empty list. Otherwise, it's going to return the results attribute. Notice my use of the triple equals here. When doing a comparison in JavaScript, always use triple equals to do comparisons. Double equals will fool you sometimes, reading the notes about that. So that's my sort of definition of my object. Now there's a little bit of weird code at the bottom here, which is labeled export to the global window object. What I'm doing here is to remember that everything that's defined inside this anonymous function will not be accessible outside of the anonymous function. It's all these variables are local to and functions are local to this module. So if I want to use this code outside, I need to export it in some way. Remember, JavaScript doesn't really have an export option until the very latest version, which we're waiting to be fully supported by browsers. So what we do is this: we know the window object corresponds to the browser window. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm creating an attribute on the window object called app. This is my new thing, and that's going to be either, if it already exists, window.app, or it's going to be this, which is essentially an empty object. So I'm creating a new placeholder, a new place where I can store things in essentially my app. And then the next thing, I'm going to define this SW on the window app as the SW that was defined here, this function, which is the object prototype. So this is basically a way of exporting this SW thing to the global window object so that I can call it. So that's that module. Remember, and we load that module, and then we start running this code. And here what I'm doing, the first thing I'm going to do is going to make an instance of a Star Wars object. Okay, so we have Windows App Model, so that's another thing inside this Windows App thing, is going to be a new Windows App SW. So that makes me a new Star Wars object, and then the first thing I'm going to do is call the getData method on that new Star Wars object. That's going to then go and issue this GET request, and at some point later in time, the data changed method will be fired, the data changed event will be fired, and then this will carry on. So on the window, I've got an on data changed, run this function. That will then say, okay, get the actual films from the model, so using the get films method, and then iterate over the films and add the episode number and title to the movies item. So there's the explanation of how that code is working. Let's have a look at it, see if it actually does go. And well, there's one I did earlier, but you can see, yes, there it is. And it's inserted the episode numbers and names into the page. So I'll put that up for you to have a look at, and there'll be some notes around this as well. But that's a walkthrough of a separation of the code that handles the model part of the page, the data handling, from the code that handles the insertion of data into the page, if you like, the view part of the application. Thank you.